So please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I'm Brian Kelly, Secretary of the State Transportation Agency. I also want to thank you for the invitation to testify before you today. As is noted by the previous speakers, what you have before you today is a draft plan, and obviously your collective input is important as that plan moves from draft to final over the next several weeks. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to use my opening statement to answer some specific questions that you sent me in a letter in preparation for this hearing. And so what I thought I would do is focus my opening on those, and then I'm happy to, following my opening, answer any questions from the committee. So first, you asked, how does the draft 2016 business plan integrate into the overall rail plan for California and with state funding programs such as the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program and the new Fast Act freight programs? Caltrans, in coordination with the High-Speed Rail Authority, regional and local rail providers, and with my Deputy Secretary for Transportation, Chad Edison, who we hired from the Federal Railroad Administration, is working on a statewide rail network planning document as a component of the next state rail plan that will be released in draft form next spring of 2017. This plan will mark a significant advancement toward approaching rail as an integrated statewide system instead of a standalone system run by operators running standalone systems. I think this is reflective of what Mr. Richard referenced in his testimony, that this project, the high-speed rail project itself, is about much more than just a fast train going up and down the spine of the state. The opportunity here, and I think first with the passage of Proposition 1A, followed by the passage of SB 1029, and in 2014 the passage of SB 862, all pointed in the direction toward modernizing and getting greater integration and connectivity between the developing high-speed rail system and the commuter, intercity, and regional systems that provide service today. And so we continue to work in that mode. And really, I think the next draft rail plan, state rail plan that you will see in spring of 17 will reflect our commitment to that greater integration, greater connectivity of rail systems and transit systems in California. This integration is important for the passenger experience and, as I said, consistent with the direction from the legislature on how to invest transit capital funds into the system. The draft 2016 business plan was informed by some of the early network planning efforts, and next year's state rail plan will incorporate the final 2016 HSR business plan in it. The Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, funded with CAP and trade proceeds, is closely linked to this vision of an integrated and modernized rail system. And this was called for in the implementing legislation, SB 862 from 2014. Under that law, the primary objectives of this cap and trade program are to modernize California's rail systems to achieve the following policy objectives: reduce GHG emissions, expand and improve rail service, integrate the rail service of the state's various rail operators, including integration with the high-speed rail system, and improve rail safety. Moreover, SB 862 expressly requires my agency, when evaluating grant applications for funds, to consider project priorities that are developed through any memoranda of understanding between state agencies and local or regional rail operators. There is no question that making TIRCP funds available as potential match funds to projects furthering either the Southern California MOU or the Northern California MOU is consistent with current law. The legislature, when enacting SB 862, provided for a continuous appropriation of cap and trade funds for this program. The statutory program was further amended by SB 9 last year in 2015, Senator Bell's bill, by a nearly unanimous vote, which requires the transition to a 5-year program cycle starting in 2018 and continuing every 2 years thereafter. SB 9 also requires a focus on larger and more transformative transit projects. Consistent with this direction to fund transformative projects, the governor's budget proposes to supplement the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Grant Program by $400 million this year. This investment will allow us to expand our transit grant program that awarded $225 million to 14 projects throughout the state last year, 13 of which, or 93%, provided direct, meaningful, and assured benefits to disadvantaged communities in California. With the expanded funding proposed in the governor's plan, the State Transportation Agency will be able to award more than $1 billion to transit improvement projects throughout California by August of this year. We've already adopted guidelines for this program under the statutory process and requirements, and applications for grant awards will be submitted to the agency by April 5th of 2016. To be cost effective in our rail investment, we need to understand co-benefits of investment for both freight and passenger services. Many upgrades to rail lines allow for both freight and passenger rail expansion, improve on-time performance, and improve safety at grade crossings. The draft 2016 business plan mentions FAST Act freight funding as a funding source for rail improvements. By recognizing the direction in the FAST Act itself to consider projects that fund grade separation for freight rail while also considering passenger rail grade separation projects, the state can best leverage multiple funding sources to speed priority rail safety and capacity projects. The second set of committee questions related to funding. You asked what steps are needed to realize long-term cap-and-trade funding for the high-speed rail program, and what is the mechanism to repay Proposition 1A bonds. First, the administration does see the cap-and-trade program as an ongoing program necessary to meet the broad climate goals outlined in AB 32, passed by the legislature in 2006. The California Air Resources Board is the entity that runs the cap-and-trade program and has stated its view that it has sufficient regulatory and legal authority to run the program beyond 2020. Therefore, the HSR, the high-speed rail draft plan, assumes the continued availability of such funds. Of course, SB 862, the law that distributes cap-and-trade funding, does not sunset in 2020, and moreover, in legislation adopted nearly unanimously just last year, SB 9, the legislature has directed my agency to consider cap-and-trade funding as available for investment well beyond 2020. I would note that the continuous appropriation of cap-and-trade dollars benefits a number of other programs, including the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, and many non-transportation related programs. I know there's a lot of discussion about the future of cap-and-trade. I have read the work, the very fine work, I think, done by the LAO on the issue. And I can tell you that while various discussions may be going on, the assumption in this plan is assumes the continued appropriation of high-speed cap-and-trade dollars would be available for all of these programs going forward. Proposition 1A bonds, the second part of your question, are voter-approved general obligation bonds of the state, and debt service will be paid on those bonds according to state law. In addition to the state general fund, under current law, a portion of transportation special fund revenue is directed to fund debt service on multiple transportation GO bonds, including Proposition 1B and Proposition 1A bonds. However, I would note that the special fund revenue available for debt service on transportation bonds is insufficient to cover the projected debt service on transportation bonds over the next 10 years, leaving the general fund to cover additional GO bond debt prospectively. And finally, the last question, Mr. Chairman, was how is the agency and the administration assisting the authority in achieving its goals and deadlines? This is a broad answer. I'm going to be as brief as I can, but suffice it to say the administration works collaboratively to support the high-speed rail program. On the environmental side, the authority is currently assisted by nearly half a dozen state entities, including the Office of Planning and Research, Department of Fish and Wildlife, State Water Resources Control Board, performing numerous environmental services. In 2012, the Department of Transportation's Legal Division, I should say since 2012, the Department of Transportation's Legal Division has provided legal services in the area of property acquisition, including legal advice to the authority and its right-of-way contractors and representation before the State Public Works Board for the authority's real property acquisitions. Of course, the Attorney General, as you know, that office provides the authority with legal representation in all litigation not related to real property. For engineering and planning, the authority has entered into a number of flexible, open-ended contracts with Caltrans in order to provide personnel resources in areas deemed necessary. Currently, the department provides federal liaison services, geotechnical and tunneling services, as well as a battery of engineering and planning personnel in order to provide the authority with additional technical expertise. Again, in the area of right-of-way, the authority is currently working closely with the State Public Works Board, the Department of General Services, to increase efficiency in property acquisition and right-of-way processes by implementing more effective delegation of responsibilities and expediting current approval mechanisms. Under the authority's current contracts with the Department of Transportation to provide relevant personnel and expertise, the department also provides the authority with additional right-of-way specialists. As of March 18th, the authority reports that they've secured legal possession of over 700 parcels toward the construction of the project and has delivered 635 to the design-build contractors. While the authority initially faced challenges with delivery of right-of-way parcels due to a number of factors, both internal and external to state government, the authority and administration have taken numerous steps to address the challenges in 2015. To address challenges, and in 2015, the average rate of acquisition was approximately 38 parcels per month. Finally, the Department of Transportation has partnered with the authority to realign portions of State Route 99 to allow for accommodation of the high-speed rail system between the existing freeway and the Union Pacific Railroad, as well as to improve traffic operations, reduce congestion, and improve safety. The department is responsible for the project's design, right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation, and eventual construction. At a higher level, Mr. Chairman, I would again mention the efforts of my agency to work with both the High-Speed Rail Authority and Caltrans to ensure our rail efforts are coordinated and integrated. In addition to touching on rail integration in the draft business plan, I believe next year's state rail plan, as I mentioned earlier, will further demonstrate this unified approach. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to turn it to the next panel member and look forward to answering your or any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We'll move on to Jessica Peters. She's a Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst for the Legislative Analyst Office. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Oops. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Jessica Peters with the Analyst Office. About 10 days ago, our office released this brief, which is our review of the high-speed rail business plan. I believe you have a copy of it in your packet. The sergeant is also handing out this handout, which is really just a summary pulling some highlights from what is in that brief. So there's nothing new, but we wanted to pull out some of the key things from our report. On page 1 of the handout, some of this is just background for you. I'll go over pretty quickly because some of the other speakers have touched on it. We just provide an overview of what's in the handout. As you know, the authority is required to put forward a business plan every even-numbered year, and they did so in February and will be adopting a final plan in May. In this presentation, we have some background information on the high-speed rail project. We describe from our perspective the 4 major features in the authority's business plan and identify 3 major issues for the legislature to consider. Page 2 of the handout, we have just some background information for you on the overall plan system, including Phase 1 and Phase 2 that you can refer back to. One piece of information that's, I think, helpful on the second checkbox, the authority had previously estimated completion of Phase 1 of the system from San Francisco to Anaheim would cost $68 billion, and that was their estimate in 2012 and the 2014 business plans. And so that's sort of the base that we're referring back to in terms of the changes in the current draft business plan. On page 3 of the handout, we have some additional background information, and again, this is just this is the currently approved plan relative to the changes that they're considering in the draft plan, and so this is helpful background information. I'll run through it really quickly. Since 2012, the authority has planned to have the initial operating segment of the high-speed rail, of Phase 1 of the high-speed rail system, to go south from Merced in the Central Valley into the Los Angeles Basin. And that was the plan since 2012 and also in the 2014 business plan. When that was the plan, the High Speed Rail Authority estimated that it would cost $31 billion to build that segment, that they would be able to operate it according to the requirements of Proposition 1A, and they estimated that it would be completed by 2022. They began initial construction on this segment in the Central Valley, also pursuant to the federal funding agreements to start construction there on an initial construction segment, which extends, or is estimated to extend 130 miles. It was initially estimated to cost $5.9 billion and be complete by 2017. And also, in terms of background information, there's been various funding sources that have been secured for the project, including $3.7 billion in Proposition 1A bond funds that have been appropriated to the authority by the legislature, $3.5 billion in federal funds, and $850 million in cap and trade revenues provided through the current year. That's estimated, including 15-16, as well as the ongoing continuous appropriation of 25% of future cap and trade auction revenues. So turning to the major features of the business plan, on page 4, we have a map that shows the proposed initial operating segment and how this differs from the previously proposed initial operating segment. So as you can see on the map, the sort of darker shaded skinny line is the proposed iOS North, which would extend from San Jose, downtown San Jose, into an area north of the city of Shafter in the Central Valley. You can also see on the map the previously planned iOS South, which would have extended from Merced slightly further north than the turnoff of the newly proposed segment, down into the San Fernando Valley in the Los Angeles area. The dashed line in the middle of the map represents the initial construction segment. That's the work that's currently ongoing in the Central Valley. So as the authority staff have mentioned already, the plan changes this initial operating segment from south to north. It would be a 239-mile segment, and the authority estimates that it would be operational by 2025, and they estimate in that first year of operation it would carry between 2.2 and 4.1 million passengers. On page 5, the next major feature of the plan that we wanted to highlight for you is that the plan updates the capital cost and schedule for the entire Phase 1 of San Francisco to Anaheim. We have a table here that presents the cost estimates in the year of expenditure dollars, which adds up to the $64 billion number that I think a lot of folks have been talking about. This includes $7.3 billion to complete the initial construction segment in the Central Valley, another $13.4 billion to extend that segment into San Jose, as well as $2.9 billion for the extensions to Bakersfield and to have service into San Francisco, and another $40.6 billion for the remainder of Phase 1, which is primarily in Southern California, but also includes the little spur up from, if you look on the previous page, up to Merced from where it currently turns off in Madera. And this adds up to a total of $64.2 billion based on the authority's estimated timeline of when these expenses would occur. I think it's also helpful to point out in terms of the timing of the expenses, the authority is estimating that the remainder of Phase 1 would begin construction in 2018 in order to be operational by 2029. And so in terms of their estimated schedule, as well as that affects some of the cost estimates in terms of timing of when those expenditures would occur. Page 6 of the plan highlights the final two major features that we wanted to point out for you. The plan does identify full funding for the proposed initial operating segment north, the Silicon Valley to Central Valley line. The draft plan identifies about $28 billion to fund the cost of this, which would include $20.7 billion for capital costs, and about $7 to $8 billion presumably related to financing costs for the cap and trade securitization that they envision. This includes $6.8 billion from Proposition 1A, $4.2 billion of which you have not appropriated yet to the authority, and so that would require legislative action. $3.2 billion of the federal funds that have been appropriated to the authority, and the remainder of the funding would come from $17.8 billion in cap and trade auction proceeds. And this is assuming $500 million a year to the High-Speed Rail Authority through the year 2050. And so in their business plan, they're looking to sort of pull forward these future revenues by securitizing them. Specifically, out of that $17.8 billion, $5.3 billion would be through 2024 on a sort of a pay-as-you-go basis, and another $12.5 billion would be from cap and trade auction revenues from 2025 through 2050, and that would support financing. Specifically, the authority estimates that would generate about $5.2 billion in financing proceeds that they could use, they would get up front in order to use to finance the construction of the initial operating segment, as well as funding to repay the interest costs on whatever sort of a financing approach that they end up using. And then the fourth major feature is that the plan assumes that additional funding will become available to complete Phase 1. The plan specifically assumes that $43.5 billion in construction costs for the remainder of Phase 1, that these funds will become available, as I said, in order to start construction by 2018 and complete it by 2029. The plan identifies some sources that could potentially partially fund these costs, including securitizing operating system revenues once they have an operational segment of the system, as well as seeking additional federal funds. But the plan does not identify a full funding package for the Phase 1 system. So now turning to the three major issues for legislative consideration. On page 7, the first one is the uncertainties regarding the funding plan for Phase 1. It is essential that the High-Speed Rail Authority develops a credible and comprehensive funding plan for Phase 1 of the system. The business plan has some uncertainties related to this funding plan, and I'll break it down into two pieces. First, regarding the initial operating segment, the authority is relying on future cap and trade auction revenues to fund this initial operating segment in their plan. However, about half of these funds would be from cap and trade after revenues that come in after the year 2020. Current law does not appear to authorize the continuation of the cap and trade program beyond 2020. And so it would appear that without legislative action, half of the funds necessary to build this initial operating segment would not be available to the authority for this project. The legislature will want to consider whether or not to approve the cap and trade program beyond 2020 on the merits of that program, which is to help the state meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals. To the extent that that program is extended, then these funds may be available for high-speed rail as well as the other programs funded from the cap and trade auction revenues. We also find that the legislature would need to take steps to facilitate the proposed securitization of cap and trade revenues. For example, the legislature may need to specify in statute that high-speed rail's share of cap and trade money is the first call, or providing a certain minimum amount of funding from cap and trade revenues. And this would really reduce the risk to potential investors by ensuring that this cap and trade revenue stream would in fact be available to meet whatever amount is required to repay the type of financing that the authority is considering. And so we think there's several, regarding cap and trade, several actions that the legislature would likely need to take in order to facilitate the type of approach and plan that high-speed rail has put forward in this draft business plan. The second concern regarding funding uncertainties is that the High-Speed Rail Authority has no complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. If the authority goes forward and builds this IOS North from the Central Valley to Silicon Valley, they will exhaust all of the identified funding sources that they have been provided or that they have identified for this project, leaving about a $40 billion gap for the remainder of the system. And the plan does contemplate potentially using operating profits and securitizing those. However, it's not clear that the system will actually generate an operating profit, and if it does, how much would actually be able to be securitized from it. Even if the authority's estimates come to pass and they are able to securitize these operating revenues at the level that they estimate, that would only get them between $3 and $7 billion from this initial operating segment, which would still fall significantly short of the amount that they would need in order to be able to build out the rest of the Phase 1 system. And so just identifying a complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1 will be a critical issue for the legislature to consider. The second issue that I want to highlight on page 8 of the handout is the scope of the initial operating segment. The legislature is going to want to weigh the trade-offs of the proposed iOS scope change. The previously planned iOS South would have connected a more populous region of the state and had higher projected ridership. However, due to its higher cost and certain technical challenges, it's not possible to complete that segment as scheduled. Because of this, to the extent that the legislature wants to ensure the continued development of some high-speed rail system, the proposed iOS North in the draft business plan has some merit. This is because this proposed Silicon Valley to Central Valley line would have about $10 billion lower construction costs than the previously proposed iOS South into the Los Angeles basin. This makes it much more likely that a full funding package for this segment could actually be achieved. We think that to the extent that the legislature is in support of the iOS North, the legislature will want to consider whether what's proposed by the High-Speed Rail Authority in their draft business plan has standalone value, or what changes might be necessary to ensure that whatever is built has standalone value. For example, the southern terminus proposed in the draft business plan does not appear to be an effective approach. This is because it would end in an agricultural area that's unpopulated and does not have the facilities that would be necessary to support train passengers, such as parking lots, rental car facilities, transit connections, and other businesses that would be necessary to support the needs of train passengers. The legislature will want to consider other options and whether or not this makes sense. For example, the legislature could direct the High-Speed Rail Authority to limit work past the last southernmost permanent station on their proposed iOS, which is near Hanford, California. They call it the Kings Tulare Station. The legislature could also make it a priority to identify the $2 billion necessary to extend the line to Bakersfield. But determining what that southern terminus is and finding something that is effective and would meet the needs of train passengers will be something for the legislature to consider as you review this plan. And lastly, on page 9, you're going to want to consider just whether or not the project has adequate legislative oversight. In terms of ensuring whether the project is on schedule and within budget, this can be really challenging with the current information that's provided in the business plans and provided to the legislature in various reports by the High-Speed Rail Authority. The legislature will want to ensure that you are receiving accurate information that's clearly laid out in a way that you can compare from one plan to the next or one report to the next to really understand what is how the project's proceeding, if there's changes in cost, whether those are related to cost increases or savings or related to change in scope. And so more detailed information is needed in order to do that. For example, the initial construction segment in the Central Valley, as I said previously, was estimated to cost $5.9 billion and be completed in 2017. The 2016 business plan assumes that it would cost $7.3 billion to complete this initial construction segment. And the authority was not able to provide to us an estimated date when this would be completed, but it would be after the initial planned date that they had first proposed to the legislature. And so the cost is different, the schedule is different, and it's really unclear. And in addition, the scope has changed. There's been parts of what they had initially planned that have been taken out of the scope, and there's been things that have been added. And so it's very difficult to track and compare what was initially proposed and provided to the legislature and how that compares with what's in their current plans, and trying to understand why the cost is higher and why the schedule is later. Is that because of things that have been added to the scope, or is that because of other things such as a cost increase? And it's really just unclear based on the way the information is provided to the legislature. And so we find that you would need more detailed information in order to facilitate this oversight. And with that, I will end my presentation and happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.